Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Buy Social Canada webinar. Today, we're going to be speaking about net zero procurement on how to engage suppliers in the race to net zero with my colleague Bob Willard from Sustainability Advantage. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and learn on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral Squamish territories. Today, I'm joining from Treaty 6 territory and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 4, on the land known as Edmonton, which is the traditional home for many Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Dene, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit. I endeavor to make this more than just words and invite you to consider what it means to live on the traditional lands in your community and what efforts we can all take to repair and improve our relations with Indigenous people locally and globally. And we're going to be speaking today a little bit about relationships too, because with social procurement, Buy Social Canada recognizes that every purchase has an economic, environmental, cultural, and social impact, whether intended or not. And with social procurement, we're really seeking to add positive intention to all of those impacts and the ripple effects that our purchasing has to shape healthy, vibrant communities. And when we start to talk about social procurement, sustainable procurement, green procurement, a lot of the times people view these things in isolation, but they're interconnected. People are a part of the environment. I like to think about Robin Wall Kimmerer and her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And sometimes folks have this perception, that people only take from the environment, but we are interconnected. And she speaks to the reciprocal relationship that we need to have and challenge that myth that we are only here to destroy nature. We are here to participate in our ecosystems, and we can positively contribute, not just negatively contribute. She says, action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, it is not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. And to me, that speaks to the interconnectedness, as Bob and I were speaking before about these polycrises that we're facing right now. We can't view these things in isolation, just the environment, just social justice. We need a just transition that looks at the system as a whole. Because it's pretty scary right now. Another book that I'm reading right now is John Valent's Fire Weather, which looks at the petrochemical age that we're in and how it is creating the heat on Earth and the fires, like wildfires across Canada, that have really been damaging and will continue to be so. It can be paralyzing, but we need to focus on action. We have everything that we need as a society to create a world that is equitable and sustainable. I continue to be astounded by the immense power of human creativity. But what we need to do is shift our system. We have a very strong and deeply embedded system right now that is founded on colonialism and capitalism, on extraction and exploitation. So enter the social value marketplace. This is where we're seeking to transform that system from focus on profit maximization for individuals to a holistic system that takes care of the planet and people for all. I truly believe that social procurement and social enterprise is the way forward. We can change our systems towards better outcomes for all by taking action in these areas. So let's talk about net zero procurement. I'm thrilled to welcome Bob Willard from Sustainability Advantage. Bob is a Buy Social Canada community champion, where he champions sustainable procurement and social procurement across so many different areas. He is a leading expert on sustainability justifications, frameworks, and procurement. Over the last 22 years, he has given many presentations, has authored 6 books, and published 2 white papers. He serves on multiple boards, including the Future Fit Foundation, the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, and B Corp Standards Advisory Council. He works for the Canadian Business for Social Responsibility program and is an advisor to the Mission from Mars Net-Zero Procurement Mission, and works with the Canadian government as an advisor for the Low Carbon Procurement Advisory Committee. Bob has received many awards for sustainability, but the one I want to highlight most and is relevant for this conversation is that Sustainability Advantage was the first company to reach the highest diamond tier of Canada's Net Zero Challenge in 2023. So I'd love to welcome Bob to teach us about his wonderful open source Net Zero Procurement Toolkit, which you can all download, and then we will have time for audience questions. Please feel free to pop your questions in the chat as we go. Welcome, Bob. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tori. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to this. And let me just reinforce that the topic for today, net zero procurement, is not instead of social procurement. It's complementary to and in addition to social procurement. So they're very synergistic, and I hope you see that as we go along. So the outline for today is a little bit about what's going on that's causing net zero procurement to be very timely, what it is, the definition, how to do it, a toolkit that helps organizations integrate these ideas into their current procurement system. And I'm going to share my master plan for saving the world, despite the polycrises that we are in now. So you might enjoy that as well. So let's start with the climate crisis. This is a kind of a serious thing. As you know, things are kind of going in the wrong direction, despite all of the efforts by governments around the world. Over 190 different organizations show up every year for these Conference of the Parties, COP, and they bring their pledges as to how they're going to reduce their greenhouse gases. And unfortunately, the pledges aren't enough to get us to where we need to get to, and countries are not even living up to those pledges. So the approach that is happening at the national level doesn't seem to be getting us to where we need to be. And this chart is showing that what we need to do is get down to net zero by 2050, 2055. And the current outlook is that we're going to go nowhere close to that. And the projections are we'll be at 2.7 degrees centigrade as opposed to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels with the current course and speed. So that's not good. Unfortunately, most businesses are sitting on the sidelines waiting for governments to fix this, and it ain't going to happen. It just is not going to happen. So we need businesses to get engaged, to set their own targets to reduce their greenhouse gases and help us stabilize the climate. Unfortunately, right now, that pressure on companies from their customers is not being exploited. And less than 3% of buyers require suppliers to disclose anything having to do with greenhouse gases or carbon or climate-related data. So what we need to do is use the buying power of governments as well as other organizations as a market force to mobilize businesses in the race to net zero. In other words, we want them to be incented and want to reduce their greenhouse gases. And if they're effective in doing that, then we just might be able to pull off the reductions that are required. So it's because of the ineffectiveness of governments who are trying to carry this load of reducing greenhouse gases that we need to roll up our sleeves, and as organizations, as businesses, make our own contribution to it. When we're talking about reducing greenhouse gases, we're talking about getting them down to 100% from where they are today by 2050 and halfway there by 2030. So that's a pretty aggressive target. And unfortunately, our progress towards those targets are not what they should be. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, has mapped out where we need to be by when, and it's up to us to try to meet those targets. And we're talking about those targets not only for Scope 1 emissions, which are the emissions coming from our consumption of fossil fuels and driving vehicles that we own as an organization, but also from the sources that we are using for electricity, that's Scope 2. And then there are these other 15 categories of Scope 3 emissions. And those targets that I just referred to before have to do with all of the greenhouse gases. So getting them all down to zero by 2050 is a big challenge. From the point of view of procurement and suppliers, the part that we're really concerned about is the so-called carbon footprints of the things that are bought by organizations, customers and buyers. Carbon footprints are the embedded carbon that is in those products from the result of the contributions of tier 1, 2, 3, 4 suppliers that are creating those products. So tier 4 suppliers, the ones that extract the raw materials from the earth, and tier 3 suppliers, the ones that smelt it and get it ready for use. Tier 2 suppliers are the ones that take those things and make parts and so on out of them. Tier 1 suppliers use those parts and build and package the goods and deliver them. So all of them are contributing greenhouse gases as a part of that, and the representative amounts of that are something that the customers are accountable for. They need to count this stuff, and it's driving them nuts. So what they need to do is not only count it, but do something about it. And that's where we can encourage these suppliers to reduce their contribution to those footprints. So that's a little bit of the background behind where we are and why we need to engage suppliers in reducing their greenhouse gases. So what is this thing called net zero procurement? Pretty straightforward. It's making sure that we get the best value for money, not necessarily the lowest price, but the best value for money by purchasing the most low carbon goods and services from suppliers who are most committed to those science-based net zero greenhouse gas reduction targets in support of the buyer's purpose, policies, and strategic goals. So it's assuming that the organization which is buying things from these suppliers cares about this already, and that they are interested in reducing not only their own greenhouse gases, but the greenhouse gases in their supply chain. This is the key part. It's the suppliers who are most committed to science-based net zero greenhouse gas reduction targets. Why? Because a lot of attention, understandably and appropriately, is given to the attributes of what it is that we're buying, whether they use recycled materials and so on, the carbon footprints of those things and so on, and that's good. But the real leverage we get is when we take a look at the organization that's producing them, and we give them credit for the fact that they are working on reducing their greenhouse gases. So net zero procurement makes greenhouse gas reductions matter to suppliers because their scores on their supplier commitment to science-based net zero targets are significantly weighted. So we not only ask them how it's going, but we weight their scores in the bid appraisal. When that happens, magic happens. All of a sudden, if it's important to the customer and they're giving a lot of points to that, it makes sense for suppliers to pay more attention to it and try to at least do better than their competitors on that. So that's net zero procurement. To their credit, the federal government already is doing something on this. They've got some pretty aggressive targets for reducing Canada's greenhouse gases. So they have already required major suppliers that do more than $25 million worth of business a year with the federal government to step up to reducing their greenhouse gases. So they have a standard for major suppliers, the large ones, as I mentioned, and they are required to do public disclosures of their current greenhouse gases, all three scopes, and they are required to set some targets and participate in the Net Zero Challenge or its equivalent. And they are also required to align with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and get involved in that as well. But the important parts are these two here. So what we have then is a federal government that recognizes that they need to engage their suppliers. And what they're saying to their large suppliers, either engage in and commit to reducing your greenhouse gases, or you don't get to be a supplier anymore with us. So this is a requirement. There are about 800 suppliers that fit in that category for the federal government of Canada, PSPC, and they're all doing that. So you'll notice that they need to participate in the Net Zero Challenge. What is that? And I'm going to show you one slide on that. Tori mentioned it before. This is where businesses, primarily companies, they're looking at municipalities as well, but right now it's mostly businesses, to voluntarily develop and implement credible and effective plans to transition to net zero emissions by 2050. So there are three things that they do. They sign a commitment letter saying that they're going to do that. They go through a preliminary questionnaire. They call it a checklist, but they're changing the name to questionnaire, which allows them within the first 12 months of making that commitment to say a little bit more about what they're doing to meet those targets. And then there's a comprehensive one that they've got 2 years to do, which goes a little bit deeper and gets into more of the targets. There are various levels of tiers and levels of performance on that. And as Tori mentioned, I just for the fun of it, I entered it, and I'm the first company in Canada to reach the diamond level Not by accident, by the way, that was very deliberate, but it shows that it's achievable. So the Net Zero Challenge requires companies to step up to doing at least their bit to reduce their greenhouse gases. And for large companies, the federal government is requiring companies to sign up to the Net Zero Challenge. For large companies, that's probably appropriate. They've got the resources and the expertise on staff to be able to do all of that. For small and medium-sized enterprises, it may be a little bit challenging. So just in terms of small and medium-sized enterprises, let me just ask you a quick question here. What percent of companies in Canada are small and medium-sized enterprises? And the definition used by Statistics Canada is between 1 and 499 employees. So if I had a scroll of all of them here, what percent of that scroll do you think would be companies with fewer than 500 employees? So just fill out that poll that's just been brought up on your screen, and we'll see what you think. And Emma, when it's appropriate, just display the results.
Just waiting on maybe 3 or 4 more people to respond, and then I can share.
There's no penalty for a wrong answer. Thank you. Okay, so quite a wide range, all the way from less than 500, 50% to more than 95%. The ones that said more than 95% are the closest. So let me just show you what the numbers are. According to Statistics Canada, large companies with more than 500 employees are 0.2% of the companies in Canada. 99.8% of the companies in Canada have fewer than 500 employees, which is staggering. And if you leave out the medium-sized companies, which are between 100 and 500 employees, and you just look at the ones that have 100 employees or fewer than 100 employees, small companies, 98.1. By the way, in the US, it's 98. In Europe, it's 98.2. In South Africa, in Africa and South America, it's about the same as well. That is to say, about 98% of the companies on the planet are small companies. And how the heck are we going to engage them in reducing their greenhouse gases? So the first question is, why do we need to? You'd think that most of the greenhouse gases are coming from the big guys, and a fair amount are. However, there is a study done by BDC last year, where they took a look at where the greenhouse gas emissions were coming from in Canada. And it turns out that 41% of the emissions are coming from small and medium-sized enterprises, either their operations or their buildings and transportation. So what we're talking about here is a very significant, they're small, but there are a lot of them. So 41% of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from them. And when they were asked, what are they doing about it? Some of them, to their credit, are taking action, but about a third of them have not taken action and have no intention of taking action. And if they don't, we're cooked. So we need to get them engaged. So we need to be able to use our buying power to incentivize all suppliers, including SMEs, to join the race to net zero. So why do I care about SMEs? Because they make up a very significant proportion of the emitters of greenhouse gases in Canada, and we need to be able to engage them in proactively reducing those emissions. So that's the definition. How do we do that? Net-Zero Procurement Toolkit has got 4 components to it. It's a free open source toolkit available, downloadable from my website. And I just want to walk you through what's in it, because from my perspective, this is going to make it easy to engage with SMEs in a way that works for them as well as works for the buyers, and makes it easy to implement this in an existing procurement system. We're not talking about throwing out your current procurement system. We're talking about adding a few things to it. Specifically, we're talking about modifying your bid appraisal template to give some significant weight points to the supplier score on their commitment to reducing their greenhouse gases, and the product score on their low carbon and circularity specifications. Another component is the tool that helps you make that assessment of the supplier. Another component is suggested product specifications you should look for the product score, and then some sample terms and conditions that help make sure that the supplier's commitment to reducing the greenhouse gases is appropriate. So I'm just going to give you a quick sense of what each of those things look like, just to reassure you that it's not that tricky, because companies already have ways of doing their bid appraisals and assessing suppliers and product specifications and terms and conditions. We're just adding some additional ones to it. So let's take a look at this bid appraisal template, which is really the core of what it is that we're talking about here. We're talking about weighting these scores on the supplier's commitment to reducing their greenhouse gases, as well as the product score, weighting them so that they represent a significant number of the points, 10 to 30% of the points associated with the bid. And we score them on how they're doing on that. We come up with a weighted score, which is their score times the weight. Notice that we are also, of course, looking at the score of the product on its quality and performance specifications, the normal things that you are looking for any good product. You're also allowing some weight for the supplier related attributes, the location, the size, whether they're a social enterprise, whether they have a diverse ownership, their track record as a company that's a going concern as well. And we also, of course, want to give some weight to the price, because that matters. Of course it matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. Those other things matter as well. And we end up with a weighted score, and that total weighted score, the best value for money is the supplier's bid with the highest total weighted score. So let me just show you an example of how this might work. Let's suppose we have an organization, supplier A, that submitted a bid, and we've assigned these weights to each of those line items that I mentioned before. 20% for the supplier score, 10% for the product score, 40% for price, really important, or total cost of ownership. And suppose the supplier scored 60% on the Net-Zero assessment tool that I'll be talking about in a second. Suppose that was their score. So their weighted score is 60 times 20, so it's 120. Product score, 50 times 10, 50. So it's just to multiply those two numbers and you end up with a weighted score. So for supplier A, the best value for money, the total weighted score is 510. Now let's suppose that their price was $700,000 for whatever it is that you're acquiring. Let's suppose we have two other suppliers that are also bidding, supplier B, supplier C. And they scored, as you see in this column here, on each of those line items, their weighted score, which is simply the 70%, for example, times 20%, that's 140. 10 times 60 is 60, and so on. So we have a weighted score for each of those, and the same thing for supplier C. Let's suppose supplier C comes in with the lowest price. This is the best price. Let's suppose it's $500,000 for whatever it is that's being purchased. Let's suppose supplier B was $600,000 and supplier A was $700,000. So what we do is we calculate what percent of those points they get as a result of that. You see the formula down there. And we end up noticing that the best total weighted score is supplier B, even though supplier C had the best price. And this is how you figure out the best, the best value. The best value is the total weighted score. And this is not rocket, it's not unusual for companies to do this, because of course they want to make sure that at least their product is a good product. It's got the quality and performance specifications that it's looking for. They've always looked at that. So when I was in IBM and I was responding to RFPs on behalf of customers, we always looked at how many points were associated with the various attributes of the products and of us that they were asking for, and made darn sure that we were the best on the things that they gave the most points to. And that's why we want to weight the supplier score on the Net Zero Ambition Assessment Tool and the product score on low carbon and circularity specs with enough weight to get the attention of the suppliers. And by the way, I should give credit to Tori for helping me think this through in a way that shows that we have better ways of figuring out best value than we used to because of the methodologies that we're bringing to bear on how we do these calculations. If you have questions on any of that, we can go into that at the end. There are also other ways that organizations are doing this, and that's fine. The bid appraisal template is the one that is in the toolkit and might be useful for some organizations. And then we have, this is a crucial part. How do you figure out where they are on committing to reducing their greenhouse gases? How ambitious are their targets? What's their commitment to reducing them? So there's a net zero assessment tool. It's got just a few questions, talks about the governance oversight of all of this. It asks them where they are on committing to reduce their scope 1 emissions to 0 by 2050 and halfway there by 2030. Same thing for scope 2, same thing for one of the scope 3s, commitment to circularity. They get bonus points if they use net zero procurement with their suppliers. So we get a bit of a ripple effect through the supply chain, or if they are producing goods and services that help others reduce their greenhouse gases. So we end up with an overall score, and that's the score that is driving the points that they get. That's the score that's used in the template. So they voluntarily disclose their commitment. If they don't want to, they don't have to, they just get 0 as a score. So it's to their self-interest to fill this thing out and make sure they get better points. The score is associated with their profile, a supplier's profile. And there's also some suggested ways in which they can actually reduce all of those. About 3 dozen different suggestions as to how they can reduce their greenhouse gases. So it's a bit of a diagnostic as well as an assessment. Other organizations, other municipalities have questionnaires that they use with their suppliers. I'm just showing you one here. There's another one that's used by Winnipeg. And Tori, maybe you'd like to say a few words about that because you helped develop.
Thanks, Bob. So this was part of a toolkit that Bi-Social Canada worked on with the City of Winnipeg as part of their Sustainable Procurement Action Plan. And we wanted to put together some questions, kind of like what Bob has, but it's just a little bit more pared down, really so that we can start to get these into bids. Because I think what's really key here is that we need the suppliers to really start to think about this and start to see that they can be rewarded through points for starting to take these things seriously and starting to look at how they can implement. So within this environmental procurement questionnaire, there are 7 areas of optional questions that staff can put into them. The ones that are particularly related to this conversation on net zero procurement are really those ones about greenhouse gas emissions, energy efficiency, and net zero by 2050. So I've highlighted those there. So if you go to the next slide, Bob, for each of those, the way that the questionnaire is set up is it asks, does your organization have a plan for, have you taken actions on, and or are you tracking and measuring the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in this question example here? And so the thing that I like about this is that an organization who's just getting started, who maybe they've only have a plan, they can still get 1 out of 3 points. If there's an organization who hasn't put something onto paper, but they've started to really just live these values and they've taken actions, they can get a point. And you can get any combinations for having a plan, action, and measurement. And so this is really a way just to start to see, okay, one question, one weighted question that could be in a bid, really start to get the ball rolling and seeing what our suppliers already doing too. It's a great learning for you when you're putting out these questions into bids to see, okay, where is our supplier base at? You know, we're not going to know where there's opportunity to push things further if we don't know where they are already. And the city of Winnipeg here has tied this into their community and energy investment roadmap, which is tying in that strategic policy piece that Bob mentioned earlier. That's really driving why this question is being asked, and their work towards net zero emissions as well, which requires their suppliers to become engaged. And so it asks for those evidence and explanations, and then it has that similar structure. And we'll pop a link in the chat. Oh yeah, Emma's already done that. She's so great. So speedy. They've made this questionnaire publicly available on their sustainable procurement website. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you. So what you see, there are different ways of doing this. If there is already a questionnaire that is being required for suppliers to complete, then you can build on that. If there isn't such a questionnaire, the ideas in the Net Zero Ambition Assessment Tool might be useful to you. That's in an Excel format. We're looking at converting it to an online format as well. But whatever you are whatever an organization is currently using as their communication vehicle with their suppliers, hopefully will be a good base on which to build some of these additional things. So different ways of making that assessment, but you end up with a score for the supplier, and you try to be fair and reasonable in the questions that you're asking, so that they don't feel totally defeated, but that they are encouraged to do better, at least better than their competitors. So I'll just quickly talk about the other two things. I'll give you one slide on the product specifications that it might be appropriate for, depending on the product, of course, that you're acquiring, and some sample terms and conditions. So product specifications, as you can see, they have a lot to do with circularity as well as with carbon. So the first set of questions might be making sure that the product is designed for being taken back or for repair and upgrades and refurbishment or disassembly, because when you can reuse the product or parts of the product, that's going to require a lower carbon or give you a lower carbon footprint than otherwise if you were doing it from virgin material. Are they using recycled, renewable, or biodegradable materials in the product as well as in the packaging? The carbon footprint, we talked about that before, of the product, greenhouse gases from shipping and delivery, and so on. So this is a sample of some of the things that you might ask about. There are probably other things depending on the goods and services that you're looking for. But it's just to reassure you that these aren't tricky. They're intended to address the kinds of things that are relevant to this particular issue, which is carbon and greenhouse gases. And you may have others as well. So some sample product specifications, and there are some sample terms and conditions that you might put into the contract with the winning supplier. So there might be financial penalties or the opposite, bonuses regarding the completion of their short-term plans to reduce their greenhouse gases. So you not only ask them about their 2050 and their 2030 plans, but do they have something that they want to do in the next couple of years? And in the terms and conditions in the contract, you can make it clear that this is not a game, that this is something you expect them to live up to, and give them bonuses or penalties depending on how they do on that. Preferred payment terms might be something else. Verification, big deal. Verifying anything to do with sustainability scores is really important, and you may want to have that supplier score verified by a qualified third party. And if it turns out that the score that they determine is more than 10% lower than what the organization submitted, then they lose the bid. Publicly communicate their progress and their commitment. Require the CEO's compensation to be linked to those net zero targets. Contract termination if they don't meet the targets. This is a variety. You wouldn't have all of these in a particular contract, but there may be a couple that would be appropriate depending on the situation. So what we want to do is make sure that we have a little teeth in all of this, that we not only ask how it's going and where they are and what their plans are, but we put some incentives in here for them to make sure that they live up to whatever commitments they said they were going to live up to. So that's the toolkit. It's got a template. It's got a tool to assess the supplier, product, and terms and conditions. Pretty simple. And again, those are all additive. They're add-ons to the current procurement processes. They're not instead of, they're in addition to and building on the current foundation. So that's the toolkit. It's free, it's open source, it's tailorable. Open source means you can do whatever the heck you want with it, change it to whatever language or specifications are more relevant or material to your situation, and so on. So let me just close with my master plan. So we're trying to get companies to reduce their greenhouse gases. And there are lots of different ways we've been trying to do that. Governments, of course, are, and depending on the jurisdiction, governments are getting increasingly aggressive on requiring companies to report on how that's going, especially in the European Union, and giving incentives, trying to help companies reduce their greenhouse gases as well. But unfortunately, not as many companies as should be are taking advantage of those incentives. So we need them to exploit those incentives more. There's also pressure from bankers, investors, and employees that are getting very uneasy about whether the company is ready for climate change. So they're putting pressure on organizations to clean up their act as well. What we want to do is add to that. It's not instead of those things, that they're all good, but what we want to do is use net zero procurement as a vehicle for the buyers, the customers, to encourage their tier 1 suppliers to reduce their greenhouse gases and their contribution to the carbon footprint. And the nice thing about the tool that I described to you that assesses them is it gives them credit as to whether they are using net zero procurement with their suppliers, and so on and so on. So there's a bit of a ripple effect caused by the tier 1 suppliers starting to ask their suppliers how it's going, and them asking their suppliers how it's going, and so on. So we start to get more action throughout the supply chain as opposed to just with the tier 1 suppliers. It's a little tricky for the customer or the buyer to bypass the tier 1 suppliers and go straight to the tier 2 suppliers. A little tricky for a whole bunch of reasons. And sometimes these folks don't want you to know who they are in the first place. So direct encouragement by the buyer to suppliers deeper in the supply chain is kind of tricky. So we want to use this approach instead. So let's suppose we pull this off.
Hey, Bob, did you see
Yeah.
Chris's hand there? He might want to jump in and ask a question about what you're showing right now, but I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen when we pull this off. Chris, do you want to chime in?
Go ahead, Chris.
I totally appreciate your presentation, Bob. I love this initiative, and I love where we in procurement will end up going with this. Fingers crossed. Bob, what I'd like to ask is, I'm a municipal government. We do a lot of RFPs, a lot of scorables. Easy to put your checklist in here, and Tori's kind of manipulated questionnaire of Winnipeg. I've got a lot of ideas, and that's the route we are going. My question is how can a small organization track this, monitor this, and maintain an objectivity that they're doing what they say? Every supplier puts on paper, check, yes, absolutely, 100%, absolutely, will do. But a year from now, I can't tell you and guarantee that they're doing what they say they're doing. We're caught in this loop that they're going to tell me everything I want to hear. Are they doing what I want them to do? Is kind of that unpoliced anonymity. And I just don't know how to track that down the road, Bob. That's my question. I'm sorry. Thank you.
No, it's a great question, because that implies overhead on the part of the procurement function to be able to do that. If you have standing offers with organizations, you normally have checkpoints with those companies, either semi-annual or annual checkpoints with them, just on how it's going and what's coming and all of those kinds of things. And that may be an opportunity for you to do a verification that their plans that they stated in their response to the questionnaire are actually coming to fruition. Or you may have a third party do that on your behalf, if you've got the wherewithal to do that. Or you may ask for funding for a third party to do that for you. So I agree that we need to be able to have checks and balances in the system and verify that the progress that was anticipated is actually happening. And we need to do that in a way that doesn't drive the procurement people nuts on all of this, or the supplier nuts. So the challenge is to figure out mechanisms to do that. And I think it's going to be easier than you might have expected, especially if they go public with their plans, which implies that from time to time they need to report on how that's going. And the requirement for annual reports in the sustainability arena is becoming much more stringent than it used to be, starting with the big guys, but moving down to the middle and smaller companies as well. So they need to perhaps report not only to the customer, but also to the public, how they're doing on targets that they set for themselves.
Yeah,
And
I agree that public reporting, I think, is a really key way to start to create that transparency and accountability that, you know, implies that there's ability for like employees, suppliers in the supply chain to call out if something isn't accurate. And maybe along with that, Bob would be having, you know, I don't know a better term for this. I always call it like a rat phone. You know, what do you do if you want to report somebody who might be lying? And I think that that is a measure that doesn't have specific costs to it as far as third-party certification and audit process, but creates a little bit of that accountability.
right. So let me just make a major assumption here. Let's suppose that we are successful in perfecting this toolkit, that we make it really simple, that we address all of the issues that we just talked about. And let's suppose that we start with the federal government of Canada. Let's suppose the federal government of Canada implemented this kind of system with all of its suppliers, not just the big guys, but small and medium-sized suppliers as well. So what we would do then is have net zero procurement used by the Canadian government with its suppliers, and hopefully that ripple effect would kick in as well. So the suppliers use this with their suppliers and so on and so on. That's a fair amount of market force. The federal government buys between 22 and $25 billion worth of business a year. So that's a lot of money. And let's suppose they package this in a way and translate it into French and so on, that it is able to be used by other jurisdictions. And let's stick with the public sector and assume those jurisdictions are provinces and territories and municipalities. And we use that at all levels of government in Canada. That's over $200 billion worth of buying power that they collectively have in Canada. That's a big market for us. And there wouldn't be many organizations that aren't directly or indirectly tied into those supply chains. And let's suppose we shake this down so that we really make it really, really slick. Online tools, a little bit of AI in there and so on, and make it really simple. And we take this idea to the next COP, COP29, and we get other countries to do the same kind of thing. So we make it a part of the final agreement that they all sign at the end, that they're going to implement net zero procurement in their jurisdictions. And by that time, we have gone global. It's in all sectors worldwide. There's no place to hide. That's $9 trillion worth of buying power in all of those jurisdictions. And I think we can pull off what needs to be done. So what we need to do is to shake down this little toolkit to make it really, really scalable, really, really easy, really, really slick, and able to move into other jurisdictions. And I think we can do that. I have been working for a couple of years on this thing, and I am really convinced that if we can engage big buyers on this, and that starts with the governments, we can perfect this in a way that not only applies to governments. I mean, procurement's procurement. If you're a corporation of any size, you could take advantage of some of these ideas as well. So we'll be fine. And by the way, this is just the beginning. This is sort of vision one of being able to control climate change in a way that is more effective than our current approaches. Now we've got mechanisms, templates and questionnaires and so on that we can build on. We can ask about other things other than just greenhouse gases and reducing their carbon footprints and so on. We can ask about other environmental things, water and waste and so on. We can ask about plastics. We can ask about more social kinds of things as well, and how the company is doing on those kinds of issues, not only internally, but with their communities. So we've got a mechanism here that we can layer onto and generate a much more appropriate set of business models to thrive in a decarbonized, more just, circular economy that we really need to get to. So that's the vision. That's the master plan. I've got a lot of stuff that might be useful to some of you. I've got a bunch of books, 5 or 6 books that I've written, a couple of white papers. I do a lot of talks on this all over the world. And what I've been talking about is one of the toolkits, the Net-Zero Procurement Toolkit, that might be useful to you. All my stuff is free and open source, the business case tools, the assessment tools, and so on. There's also a master slide deck you can subscribe to. So the point of this is that there are resources of it. If you decide to do it, there is no lack of, these are just my resources. My goodness, there are so many other resources out there. By Social Canada, Canadian Coalition for Sustainable Procurement, the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. There's a lot of good stuff out there. So the big decision is the decision that you are going to do it. Then we can figure out how to do it in a way that works for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. There's so much work being done here to really create that foundation that any organization, as you say, can get started and can pick even just one piece from your toolkit and really start to put that into action, because I think action is needed now more than ever. We've got one more question that came up in the chat. Was about the key difference between the Net-Zero Procurement Toolkit and your Sustainable Procurement Toolkit.
Yeah, the template is basically the same, except the first 2 lines, rather than just looking at the carbon or the commitment to reducing greenhouse gases. It's more holistic. It's looking at all aspects of the company's impacts, both social and environmental impacts. So it uses a tool, it's called the Basic Sustainability Assessment Tool, BSAT, which is also free, open source, available on my website. Which asks about the core sustainability things, including greenhouse gases. So frankly, the net zero version of that, I simply took out the questions that had to do with greenhouse gas reductions and put them into a smaller toolkit. But if you wanted to go the whole 9 yards on this stuff, we've got the complete suite of questions that you might want to ask, as you were doing in that Winnipeg questionnaire. I mean, you're asking about a lot of good things there. And there are others as well that you might want to consider. So the master set of all of the kinds of questions you might want to ask are in the Basic Sustainability Assessment Tool. The product specifications are very similar, and terms and conditions are the same. So it's mostly in the questionnaire that's different.
That's great. Thanks so much. Yeah, there's so many other dimensions of sustainability that are covered in that broader toolkit, but I think as we are seeing in this poly crisis, the one that will be most lasting and damaging is the climate crisis, and we need to take action. The situation in the world, if we head to 2.7 degrees of warming, which we're on track to now, is a very, very scary place where the planet becomes unlivable for a lot of people and plants, including the food that we eat and the water that we need to drink. So not to get too bleak, but just to inspire action, please consider using these tools. And I think one interesting thing that came up to me during the conversation was, how do we make this, approachable for SMEs? So Buy Social Canada has registered for the Net Zero Challenge. I encourage all of your organizations to sign up. It's easy to get started. And then Bob's got great tools. They've got tools on there to really help you go through it. And it's not easy. We're still working on mapping out all of our emissions as an organization, but we plan to make that publicly available and to showcase where we're at once we've got all those calculations figured out. And I think it's really important just to like take a step. If you haven't taken any action as an organization, put a question in an RFP, have a conversation with your team about what are we doing to track our own emissions. Really just get started because we all need to be moving forward in this direction and to be developing the processes to start to track, measure, and then shift our emissions.
And just building on the get started message that you just made, I think we should encourage pilots. Encourage pilots. I live in Whitby, Ontario. I'm on the Whitby Sustainability Advisory Committee, which is a group of citizens that are interested in this. And I'm in dialogue with the Whitby procurement people to see how ready they are to implement the Net-Zero Procurement Toolkit. So in the town that I'm in right now. But I'm framing it as a pilot. I said, try it. Pick a few suppliers, 3 to 5 suppliers, and try the questionnaire on them and see how that works for them, how it works for you. Is this going to be resulting in much more expensive products because the company is more sustainable or paying more attention to greenhouse gas reductions? Does that mean their products are going to be more expensive? I don't think so, but they need to figure that out for themselves and get into that best value calculation as opposed to best price calculation. Because Whitby as a town has some very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets, 0 by 2045. How the heck are they going to pull that off if they don't engage their suppliers? So, and they do have a sustainable procurement policy, but it's wonderfully ambiguously written so that it's open to interpretation. So I'm helping them kind of flesh out the bones of that as well. But I think and it's the same with the federal government. I'm not saying do it all of a sudden for everybody. I'm saying try it, see how it works for you and for your suppliers, and refine it and make darn sure this is going to be a good thing and does engage them in a positive way towards reducing their greenhouse gases, and use it as a diagnostic. If they're hung up on some particular action that they should be taking, but they can't, let's figure out how as a government, you might be able to help them overcome that problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. Getting started, trying things out, and remember there's support. Reach out to BiSocial Canada, reach out to Bob. There's a big network there. Have conversations with your team, with your family and friends. I love hearing about like local based grassroots initiatives like that committee in Whitby. I think that's really going to be needed as well. So really think about how you can get involved to start to move towards net zero as an individual, as an organization, as part of your community.
Yeah, it's really important. I'm I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, and this is kind of personal. We've really got to fix climate change. And I've been thinking a long time about how the heck do I, as one little guy, make any difference? And I think if we can figure out how to scale the approach that I just described, we've got a fighting chance of being able to do what needs to be done in time. Not because the other things aren't ever going to make things happen, pressure from government and investors and so on. It's all good, but it's not happening fast enough.
No,
So
and we need to shift that whole system, every part of that system dynamic that we can. If we can shift where the pressure is for how we're going to act, what decisions we're making, that's all. We need every action that we can to move that system because it is so strong right now. Yeah,
and I think the world is ready. I think the message about the seriousness of climate change is starting to sink in. You're smelling the smoke and wading in the floods. So, I think we should stop dancing around and get on with it.
All right. Well, that will be our call to action, is to stop dancing around. So I'm a pro dancer. So I think it's important to bring joy into these movements as well. But yeah, I invite all of you on today to really think about what steps you can take next. So thank you so much, Bob. Thank you everyone who joined us for your questions and your time today. Emma will be sending out all of the links that she's been sharing in in the chat. There's lots of great resources there. And please, as we said, reach out to us if you have any questions, and we look forward to hearing from you, how this goes, if you'd like to share back and let us know. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Bob.
And thank you, Tori, for all the good work that you and Emma and the other folks in Bisocial Canada are doing. Really, really important work.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Take care.